In the spring of 1834, somewhere inside the rolling hills of Crucial, Virginia, a discovery became made that could for all time exchange how we apprehend the depths of human evil. 47 kids, a while ranging from 6 to 16, have been observed chained in a basement underneath what appeared to be a normal farmhouse. The youngsters bore no resemblance to every other, spoke one-of-a-kind languages, and whilst wondered, should simplest whisper one call through their tears. Mom Sullivan, the local sheriff's document, buried for over a century within the Henry County data, described scenes so traumatic that 3 of the investigating officers resigned from obligation within per week. What makes this case virtually haunting is not simply the horror of what become discovered. However, the chilling consciousness that consistent Sullivan have been operating her twisted employer for over a long time without detection. The children called her Mom. However, the truth behind that name would show a long way extra sinister than all people ought to have imagined. Before we keep with the story of the Sullivan-owned family and their unspeakable secrets and techniques, I want to ask you something crucial. This channel isn't for absolutely everyone. Most effective for the bravest souls who dare to confront the darkest chapters of Yankee history. In case you've made it this some distance, you are now not like the general public. You understand that a few truths are too frightening to disregard, regardless of how a lot they disturb us. So, hit that subscribe button and join our network of real thriller seekers. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you brave, sufficient to hear testimonies like this from your own outdoor? The question that haunted investigators then, and maintains to perplex historians these days, is how this kind of large operation ought to have gone undetected for so long in a close-knit rural community. The Virginia of 1834 was a land caught between worlds. The old plantation system nonetheless ruled the social landscape at the same time as whispers of business change drifted down from the north. In this environment, the small farming community of Millbrook, a set of possibly 50 families, unfold across the mild slopes of Henry County, represented the everyday American rural settlement of the generation. Maximum residents farmed tobacco or corn, traded at Henderson's preferred store, and accrued for social activities at the one-room schoolhouse that doubled as a network meeting hall. The Sullivan belongings sat on the outskirts of this community, a modest 2-story timber farmhouse surrounded by means of nearly 200 acres of prime agricultural land. To any visitor passing alongside the dusty street that connected Millbrook to Richmond, the Sullivan farm seemed wholly unremarkable. The residence itself, constructed inside the Federal fashion, famous in the course of the 1810s, featured white-painted clapboard siding and a wraparound porch, typical of Virginia structure. A pink barn stood 60 backyard behind the residence, with a chook coop and smokehouse completing the everyday farmstead format. What made the Sullivan property specific wasn't visible from the street. Ezra Sullivan, who had purchased the land in 1809 with cash inherited from his father's tobacco fortune, had spent significant effort increasing the house's basement. At the same time as most Virginia houses of the period featured easy root dealers, the Sullivan basement prolonged a ways past the footprint of the house above. Local craftsmen remembered being hired for various excavation initiatives during the 1810s and 1820s, even though none had seen the finished paintings. Ezra paid properly and in cash, asking handiest that the workers' recognition on their assigned sections in place of the general undertaking. Constance Sullivan, Ezra's wife, had arrived in Millbrook in 1811 as a bride of 22. Acquaintances remembered her as a good-looking girl with dark hair and a strangely tender voice. She dressed truly, however, well, attended the Methodist church services while health accredited, and maintained a popularity for charitable works. When approached about contributing to network reasons, Constance might inevitably explain that she and Ezra had been already caring for several orphan children from her circle of relatives back in Pennsylvania. The association, she explained, become brief, simply until appropriate permanent houses will be observed. This explanation gladdened the network's curiosity. Approximately the occasional glimpses of youngsters around the Sullivan belongings. Mrs. Henderson at the General Save would once in a while see a young face peering from the Sullivan wagon. When Constance got here to city for components, the youngsters never spoke. However, Constance would give an explanation for that they had been shy, traumatized through the lack of their parents, and needed time to modify to their new instances. The network, acquainted with the tragedy of orphaned youngsters in an era of high mortality, quotes universal these reasons without query. Thomas Henderson, who ran the General Keep, later recalled that Steady Sullivan turned into one of his maximum reliable clients. Each 2 weeks, she would arrive with an in-depth list and enough cash to purchase extensive portions of fundamental foodstuffs: flour, cornmeal, salt, pork, molasses, and different staples. The quantities appeared huge for a childless couple, but whilst Thomas noted this, Constance would remind him about the orphaned children. She additionally purchased unusual amounts of fundamental drugs, explaining that kids from negative occasions regularly arrived with numerous illnesses that required treatment. The Sullivan farm operated on a timetable that, at a loss for words, some neighbors, at the same time as most farming households, rose with the solar and labored until dusk. Activity at the Sullivan assets frequently continued well into the evening. Lights will be visible in the farmhouse windows at uncommon hours, and the sound of hammering or construction paintings on occasion echoed across the fields at some point of the night. While asked about these activities, Ezra would give an explanation for that he began making improvements to deal with the growing quantity of youngsters of their care. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the visiting physician who served the Millbrook vicinity, remembered being referred to as to the Sullivan farm on several activities for the duration of the 1820s and early 1830s. Every time he changed into advised that one of the orphaned youngsters had fallen unwell and wished scientific attention. But Dr. Whitfield became in no way accepted to examine the kids immediately. As a substitute, Constance could describe the signs and request unique medicinal drugs. Whilst the doctor insisted on seeing his patients, Constance might explain that the children had been too fearful of strangers, too traumatized by using their stories to allow examination via unusual guise. The deception became so entire that even the neighborhood pastor, Reverend Samuel Matthews, believed in the Sullivan-owned family's charitable work. In the course of his occasional visits to the farm, Reverend Matthews could reward Constance and Ezra for his or her Christian compassion in worrying for so many unlucky children. He provided to assist discover everlasting houses for the orphans. However, Constance might continually provide an explanation for that she was already in correspondence with family in Pennsylvania who would ultimately take the kids. The method, she assured him, certainly required staying power and careful arrangement. What not one of the network participants realized was that regular Sullivan were perfecting her deception for over a long time. The orphaned youngsters have been not transient residents, waiting for placement with loving family. They have been prisoners, purchased, kidnapped, or lured from their households throughout multiple states, held in conditions that would make hardened criminals weep with horror. The invention that might disclose the Sullivan circle of relatives as bad secrets began with a sequence of apparently unrelated incidents in the early months of 1834. February have been unusually harsh, with temperatures losing well underneath freezing for weeks at a time. The bitter bloodlust that gripped Virginia that wintry weather might prove to be each a blessing and a curse for the 47 children trapped beneath the Sullivan farmhouse. On February 23, 1834, a touring merchant named Jacob Stern began making his manner from Richmond to Charlottesville, while a violent snowfall pressured him toward trying to find refuge. The Sullivan farm, being the closest building visible from the street, appeared like a natural desire for emergency lodging. Ezra Sullivan, no matter his apparent reluctance, could infrequently refuse hospitality to a stranded traveler at some point of such dangerous climate. Stern later described the night as uncomfortably irritating. Regular Sullivan served a simple meal of cornbread and salt red meat. However, verbal exchange was stilted and awkward. The Sullivans seemed frightened, constantly changing glances and starting at each sound. When Stern requested approximately the kids he had been told lived at the farm, Constance defined that they have been all sleeping and shouldn't be disturbed. The kids, she said, had been ill with fever and wished their rest. What disturbed Stern most turned into the sound. Throughout the nighttime, as he lay on a makeshift bed in the Sullivan parlor, he could listen what sounded like muffled crying coming from under the floor. While he referred to this to Ezra the next morning, Sullivan claimed it become likely just wind whistling via gaps inside the foundation. The sound was commonplace in old homes, mainly during bloodless weather. Stern widespread this clarification, but something approximately the Sullivan's manner persisted to problem him. The second incident befell 3 weeks later on March 15th. Mary Catherine Flynn, a younger Irish immigrant, touring with her circle of relatives to seek work in the tobacco fields around Richmond, have become separated from their organization at some stage in a river crossing. Exhausted and nervous, she made her way to the Sullivan farm. As darkness fell, Constance Sullivan took her in, supplying meals and safe haven for the night time. Mary Catherine was by no means seen alive again. While her family stated her lacking to the sheriff in Richmond, they defined their remaining known location and the path Mary Catherine have been heading. A search party changed into prepared. However, the vast expanses of Virginia wasteland made locating an unmarried missing person almost not possible. The search changed into referred to as off after per week, and Mary Catherine Flynn was presumed to have died of publicity or been killed by wild animals. The final incident that might lead to the invention occurred on April 2, 1834. A neighborhood farmer named William Hutchinson changed into looking rabbits inside the woods that bordered the Sullivan assets when he heard something that stopped him cold. From somewhere near the Sullivan farmhouse, God heard the sound of kids screaming. Now not the normal cries of kids at play, but uncooked, determined shrieks of natural terror. Hutchinson crept closer to investigate, hiding in the back of a stand of oak trees approximately 50 yards from the Sullivan house. For almost an hour he watched and listened. The screaming continued intermittently, always seeming to come from under the residence in preference to from inner it. At one factor, he noticed Ezra Sullivan emerge from what seemed to be a cellar door on the aspect of the house. Sullivan appeared round nervously, then disappeared, returned underground. While Hutchinson suggested what he had witnessed to his pals, critiques were divided. Some suggested that the orphan kids might be greater than the Sullivans had indicated, perhaps requiring discipline or medical remedy that might be distressing. Others, however, commenced to don't forget peculiar information that hadn't regarded important before. The unusual quantities of food regular Sullivan bought, the atypical sounds pals every now and then heard at night, the fact that not one of the men orphans had ever been seen on the town or at network gatherings. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, a veteran lawman who had served Henry County for over 15 years, to begin with brushed off the concerns as community gossip. But when William Hutchinson approached him directly and insisted on submitting a proper complaint, Crawford agreed to research. The law required him to follow up on reviews of capability child abuse, no matter his personal opinion of the accusers. At the morning of April 8, 1834, Sheriff Crawford rode out to the Sullivan farm, followed through his deputy Marcus Webb. They arrived simply after dawn, awaiting to behavior a ordinary inspection that could position the network rumors to rest. Regular Sullivan met them at the door, her way calm and alluring. She invited the officers inner for espresso, and expressed situation about the gossip circulating inside the network. The communication started out usually enough. Constance defined once more approximately the orphan kids, confirmed the officers' letters she claimed to have received from household in Pennsylvania, and provided to set up for the children to satisfy with Sheriff Crawford once they recovered from their recent contamination. Everything appeared flawlessly affordable, till Deputy Webb asked to apply the privy. As Webb walked around the aspect of the house, he noticed something that made his blood run bloodless. The cellar door that William Hutchinson had seen Ezra Sullivan the usage of turned into secured with 3 separate padlocks. Heavy chains wrapped across the door handles, and the wood around the locks confirmed signs and symptoms of determined clawing, as though someone had tried to scratch their manner out from the inner. Whilst Webb again to the house, and quietly informed Sheriff Crawford about what he had found. Each man knew they had been handling something some distance more extreme than network gossip. Crawford, with courtesy, asked Constance to reveal them the cellar, explaining that an intensive inspection could assist place the rumors to rest. The exchange in Constance Sullivan's demeanor turned into immediate and chilling. Her face went light, her arms started out to tremble, and he or she started stammering approximately how the cellar was dangerous, how the kids were not allowed down there, how there has been not anything to see, however antique farm device and garage. That turned into when they heard it. From someplace underneath their feet came the sound of kids crying, observed by means of a vulnerable voice calling for assist. The sound became muffled but unmistakable, and it became coming from without delay beneath the kitchen wherein they stood. The instantaneous aftermath of that first discovery might haunt Sheriff Crawford for the relaxation of his life. When he and Deputy Webb pressured open the cellar door, the stench that rose from the darkness underneath was overwhelming. A combination of human waste, unwashed our bodies, and something else that Crawford later defined as the odor of despair itself. The basement that Ezra Sullivan had spent over 2 decades building became a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. The main chamber stretched some distance past the footprint of the house above, extending into the earth like an underground warren. Stone walls carefully mortared and designed to muffle sound created a sequence of interconnected rooms. The biggest chamber immediately below the kitchen housed most of the children. They had been chained to iron rings embedded within the stone partitions, each child secured via shackles round their ankles. The chains had been long enough to permit movement inside a small region, however averted any opportunity of breakout. The children ranged in age from approximately 6 to 16 years antique. They had been emaciated, their clothes reduced to rags, their bodies bearing the marks of prolonged forget and abuse. Many showed symptoms of illness, fever, respiratory problems, and skin situations that got here from living inside the damp, unventilated underground space. What struck each officials most forcefully turned into the silence. After the preliminary cries for assist, the children stated nothing. They certainly stared at the beginners with eyes that held no desire, no expectation of rescue. Deputy Webb, a father of 4, needed to go away the basement twice to vomit. Sheriff Crawford, notwithstanding his years of regulation enforcement revel-in, found himself not able to manner the whole scope of what he became seeing. The methodical nature of the imprisonment, the evidence of lengthy term planning, the sheer number of sufferers, it became beyond something in his experience or creativeness. In the smaller chambers, Crawford and Webb determined evidence of the Sullivan system of control. One room contained stocks and restraining gadgets for punishment. Every other held what appeared to be a primitive scientific place wherein the children were dealt with for injuries and ailments. No longer out of compassion, however, to hold them alive and useful. A third room contained designated facts that would prove crucial to the research. Names, a while, dates of arrival, and notes about every child's circumstance and behavior. The information revealed the scope of the Sullivan operation. Kids had been arriving on the farm frequently in view that 1812, shortly after Constance Sullivan came to Millbrook. The assets numerous. A few were orphans bought from beaten bad houses. Others have been runaways lured by means of promises of food and refuge. And nevertheless, others seemed to were certainly kidnapped from their households. The record showed that over the years extra than 90 youngsters had surpassed through the Sullivan basement. The plain question, what had befell to the others, become replied inside the most frightening manner possible. In a separate chamber reached through a slender passage that required crawling. Crawford and Webb determined the remains of at the least 36 youngsters. Some appeared to have died from contamination or malnutrition. Others confirmed symptoms of violence. All had been buried in shallow graves under the basement ground, their bodies included with lime to govern scent and rot. The investigation that observed the initial discovery would maintain for months, as government struggled to apprehend how this type of large crook organization had operated undetected for over decades. The solution lay in Steady Sullivan's genius for deception and her knowledge of human psychology. She had created a persona that turned into nearly flawlessly designed, to keep away from suspicion in a rural 1830s community. The person of the charitable female, being concerned for orphaned youngsters, appealed to the network's Christian values, at the same time as explaining away any uncommon components of the Sullivan family. The tale of traumatized youngsters who had been too frightened to interact with strangers supplied an equipped excuse for why the supposed orphans were by no means visible in public. The claim that everlasting houses were being arranged with remote relatives explained why the kids by no means appeared to depart the farm. Even more cleverly, Constance had created more than one layers of safety for her operation. The children had been taught to name her mom, making sure that if everyone ever overheard them, it'd appear to be a natural own family relationship. The few instances children had been glimpsed with the aid of outsiders, they have been cautiously coached to stay silent and seem shy in preference to terrified. The good-sized meals purchases were explained by way of the presence of multiple kids, even as the medical components were justified via the supposed negative health of orphan children. The physical setup of the operation turned into similarly nicely deliberate. The basement production had been spread over many years, with distinctive people managing exceptional factors of the project. No unmarried craftsman had seen the complete layout or understood the authentic purpose of the changes. The soundproofing became effective enough that even near friends hardly ever heard whatever suspicious. And once they did, the sounds could be explained as regular farm sports or the ordinary noise of youngsters gambling. Perhaps most traumatic changed into the psychological control machine that Constance had evolved. The children have been informed that they had been abandoned by means of their households, that nobody turned into searching out them, and that the outside global become risky and antagonistic. Individuals who behaved nicely have been given slightly better food and living situations. Folks that precipitated trouble had been subjected to punishments that served as examples to the others. Through the years, most of the youngsters prevalent their captivity as virtually the way their lives were meant to be. The community's response to the invention turned into one in every of whole surprise and disbelief. Many citizens, to begin with, refused to believe that regular Sullivan, the quiet woman who had lived among them for over 20 years, might be able to such tremendous acts. Some advised that she ought to have been coerced by her husband, or that the complete state of affairs became some way a misunderstanding. Those denials became impossible to maintain as more evidence emerged. The specified statistics found inside the basement protected not simply statistics. Approximately the kids, however, also correspondence with crook contacts in other states. Regular Sullivan were a part of a network that trafficked in youngsters buying and promoting young victims throughout nation traces. The Sullivan farm became simply one operation in a larger criminal company that stretched from Pennsylvania to Georgia. As Sheriff Crawford delved deeper into the Sullivan case, stressful styles started out to emerge that advised the operation become some distance more sophisticated than first of all believed. The correspondents discovered in the basement found out that Constance Sullivan were in normal touch with at the least 12 other people throughout 5 states, all apparently worried in comparable activities. The letters, written in a simple code that was in the end deciphered, discussed merchandise deliveries and nice manage in language that virtually mentioned human trafficking. One letter dated just 3 months before the invention got here from a person identified simplest as a Morrison in Philadelphia. Morrison wrote that he had 6 new items of varying ages and conditions that could be appropriate to your requirements. The letter blanketed specified descriptions of the youngsters, their approximate ages, and their physical situations. Most disturbingly, it blanketed notes about their temperaments, which youngsters were compliant, and which might require additional education. The economic information painted an excellent extra frightening photograph. Regular Sullivan had been paying between $50 and $200 per child, relying on age and condition. She had also been receiving payments from different places, suggesting that the Sullivan farm served as both a vacation spot and a distribution factor for trafficked youngsters. The full amount of money concerned became outstanding for the term, over $80 in transactions over too many years. equivalent to numerous hundred zero in modern-day forks. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the journeying medical doctor who had been called to the Sullivan farm on numerous activities, became a key witness as the investigation extended. Beneath questioning, he revealed that Constance Sullivan had continually been surprisingly particular about the medicines she asked. She had particular information of treating malnutrition, breathing infections, and different situations commonplace in significantly overlooked children. She had also asked for sedatives and other tablets that could be used to control difficult prisoners. The doctor's testimony caused any other chilling cognizance. Consistent Sullivan had been systematically reading how to keep big numbers of kids alive under situations of excessive deprivation. The clinical materials she purchased, the questions she asked, even the format of the basement, everything turned into design to maximize the survival fee of her prisoners while minimizing the sources required to preserve them. Neighborhood businessman Thomas Henderson provided additional portions of the puzzle. A valuate of his sales file confirmed that Constance Sullivan had been shopping growing quantities of simple components over the years. What appeared to be the growing wishes of a charitable family changed into definitely evidence of an expanding criminal operation. Henderson also remembered precise requests for items that seemed uncommon on the time: greater blankets, big portions of children's clothing, and bulk purchases of simple drug treatments. The investigation additionally found out the position of Ezra Sullivan in the operation. Whilst Constance appeared to be the mastermind, Ezra turned into responsible for the physical maintenance of the prison and the handling of the kids. Several of the surviving victims, once they had been eventually capable to speak, described him as the enforcer who completed punishments and maintained field. His construction work at the basement hadn't been simply growth. It had been regular refinement of a machine designed to preserve human beings in captivity. The most stressful revelation got here from reading the records of kids who had disappeared from the Sullivan farm over time. The ledgers showed that some youngsters had been transferred to different places, suggesting a community of shoppers and dealers throughout more than one state. Others were marked as wrong or intricate, entries that corresponded with the stays located in the basement burial chamber. The scope of the research extended as authorities in other states began analyzing their personal unsolved disappearances. Missing youngsters reviews from Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina, and South Carolina showed disturbing similarities. A number of the lacking kids in shape the profile of these located at the Sullivan farm. Terrible, orphaned, or from households that have been not going to have assets to search for them substantially. Federal marshals had been known as in to coordinate the multi-nation investigation. This was remarkable for the time period, as maximum law enforcement turned into strictly local. The Sullivan case represented one of the first important crook investigations to go state traces and contain federal authorities. The felony implications had been complex with the aid of the truth that some of the crimes had came about in special jurisdictions below special legal guidelines. As weeks succeeded, greater survivors started to inform their tales. The money owed were remarkably steady, describing years of imprisonment, systematic abuse, and mental manipulation. The children defined how new arrivals have been broken in, subjected to isolation, punishment, and indoctrination until they frequent their destiny. They talked about a complex hierarchy. Some of the prisoners, with older youngsters given minor privileges in change for supporting to manipulate more youthful ones. The survivors additionally discovered the extent of consistent Sullivan's psychological manipulation. She had satisfied a few of the children that they were worthless, that their households had offered them or deserted them, and that they deserved their remedy. A number of the older kids, who had been imprisoned for years, initially resisted rescue efforts because they had been conditioned to agree with that the outside international become even greater risky than their captivity. The investigation uncovered proof of Sullivan's methods for acquiring victims. She had evolved relationships with corrupt officers at poor houses and orphanages who would offer children in change for bills. She had additionally cultivated contacts amongst crook elements in important towns who may want to discover susceptible kids, runaways, avenue orphans, and others who would not be neglected straight away. Possibly maximum chillingly, the information showed that the Sullivan operation had been expanding in current years. The wide variety of kids being held had extended, and there were plans inside the correspondence for establishing comparable facilities in other locations. The invention on the Sullivan farm had reputedly interrupted a criminal corporation that became at the verge of becoming a much larger operation. The breakthrough that might lead to the entire publicity of the Sullivan network came from a surprising supply. Some of the surviving youngsters turned into a lady named Rebecca, about 14 years vintage, who have been held longer than any of the others. Not like the other youngsters who have been damaged through their ordeal, Rebecca had maintained a spark of defiance and an high-quality reminiscence for details. Rebecca were kidnapped from her own family's farm in Pennsylvania in 1829, while she changed into just 9 years old. She remembered the entirety about her seas, how a lady claiming to be a distant relative had arrived at their farm, how she had been lured away with guarantees of chocolates and a journey to town, how she had awakened chained in the Sullivan basement. Extra importantly, she remembered each conversation she had overheard between regular Sullivan and the diverse visitors who had come to the farm over time. Rebecca's testimony revealed that the Sullivan operation changed into simply one part of a far larger network. She had heard Constance discussing other farms, other places wherein children have been being held. She remembered names, dates, and details about shipments of children being moved between exclusive centers. Her information furnished law enforcement with their first complete image of the scope of the crook agency. The maximum full-size revelation came when Rebecca defined a go to that had occurred just 2 weeks earlier than the invention. A nicely dressed man had arrived on the farm in an costly carriage, accompanied by means of different men. Rebecca had been selected alongside 3 different children to be inspected by using the traffic. The person had examined them carefully, checking their tooth, their muscle tone, and their standard health, like a purchaser evaluating livestock. The visitor had in the end decided now not to purchase any of the children, complaining that they were too broken for his purposes. But he had left in the back of a letter containing particular specs for the type of kids he wanted to purchase. The letter, which became found amongst Steady Sullivan's papers, defined necessities for kids of unique a long-time bodily traits and temperaments. The language turned into bloodless and businesslike, discussing human beings as commodities to be offered and sold. The letter became signed H. Blackwood and included a go-back address in Charleston, South Carolina. While authorities investigated, they found that Henry Blackwood was a rich plantation proprietor who had been buying kids for years, ostensibly as household servants, but certainly for functions that the investigation would monitor to be even greater sinister than the Sullivan operation. The Blackwood connection spread out a wholly new size of the case, not like enslaved folks that had a few felony protections and whose disappearance might be observed. Trafficked kids might be worked to loss of life without a prison outcomes. They'd no households to search for them, no criminal reputation to defend them, and no wish of getaway. The research of the Blackwood connection revealed that numerous other outstanding Southern families had been concerned in comparable purchases. The children have been getting used, now not simply as workers, but as topics for clinical experiments, as goals for violent leisure, and for purposes that the investigators found too traumatic to report completely of their legitimate reports. Because the scope of the crook community have become clean, the investigation faced increasing resistance from powerful interests. Several of the families concerned in buying children had full-size political connections and sizable sources to defend themselves. Threats started to be made against investigators, witnesses, or even the surviving children. Sheriff Crawford obtained anonymous letters warning him to drop the investigation. Deputy Webb became attacked with the aid of unknown assailants, even as strolling home from work. Medical Dr. Whitfield found his clinical exercise suddenly boycotted by way of numerous outstanding patients. The pressure became clearly designed to intimidate regulation enforcement and prevent the overall extent of the network from being uncovered. The situation had become even greater dangerous, while one of the surviving youngsters, a boy named Timothy, who were providing essential testimony, disappeared from the transient refuge wherein he changed into being housed. A search was conducted, however Timothy was by no means found. The message turned into clear. Individuals who cooperated with the investigation would face excessive outcomes. No matter the intimidation, the research persisted. Federal marshals furnished extra safety for key witnesses and investigators. The surviving children had been moved to more cozy locations, and armed guards were posted on the Sullivan farm to shield the bodily evidence. The case had become a take-a-look-at of whether or not the American prison system should characteristic whilst faced with crimes related to rich and effective perpetrators. The pressure reached its height when Steady Sullivan herself became determined useless in her jail cell. The legit purpose of dying became indexed as suicide. However, the situations were suspicious. Sullivan had been scheduled to testify about the full extent of the criminal network, inclusive of the names of all her contacts and customers. Her loss of life removed the research's maximum crucial witness and supply of information about the wider conspiracy. The mysterious dying of Constance Sullivan sent surprise waves through the research group. If effective pastimes had been willing to dispose of key witnesses, nobody involved in the case turned into secure. The investigation had exposed a criminal corporation so significant and so nicely linked that it posed a threat to some of the maximum distinguished families in American society. Simply while it appeared that the investigation might be derailed via intimidation and violence, and sudden improvement changed the whole thing. A former worker of Henry Blackwood, encouraged by way of guilt over what he had witnessed, got here forward with evidence that could blow the case huge open. The employee, a man named Samuel Pierce, had labored as an overseer on the Blackwood plantation and had precise know-how of the youngsters who had been bought from the Sullivan network. Pierce delivered with him documents that proved the relationship among the Sullivan operation and the Southern consumers. More importantly, he had witnessed the fate of the various kids who were bought to plantation owners. His testimony could offer the very last portions of the puzzle and divulge the overall horror of what had been happening to the USA's maximum vulnerable children. Samuel Pierce's testimony, earlier than the federal grand jury in Richmond, might go down as one of the maximum worrying deaths in American felony records. Pierce, a man in his 40s with weathered fingers and haunted eyes, had worked for Henry Blackwood for over a decade. What he had seen at the Blackwood plantation, and what he revealed approximately the destiny of the Sullivan youngsters, bowled over even the pro-investigators who had concept. They understood the scope of the crook organization. Pierce defined how the Blackwood plantation operated separate structures. The primary plantation used enslaved hard work for cotton production, working below the everyday, although brutal economic version of Southern agriculture. However, Blackwood had additionally set up what Pierce called the experimental quarters, a separate facility where the trafficked youngsters had been held for purposes that had not anything to do with agricultural manufacturing. The kids bought from the Sullivan community have been used as topics for scientific experiments that Blackwood carried out with several friends, consisting of physicians from Charleston Clinical University. The experiments had been designed to check the bounds of human endurance, to have a look at the results of numerous capsules and treatments, and to fulfill the scientific curiosity of fellows who regarded the children as laboratory animals in preference to humans. Pierce's most damning testimony worried the special facts that Blackwood maintained of those experiments. The plantation owner had documented the whole thing. The children's reactions to distinctive remedies, their survival fees under diverse conditions, and the progression of sicknesses that had been deliberately added to study their result. The report showed that Blackwood and his associates had been engaging in systematic torture disguised as scientific studies. The testimony found out that at least 37 youngsters from the Sullivan network had been bought to Blackwood through the years. Of these, only 4 had survived long enough to be transferred to other consumers. The relaxation had died because of the experiments, malnutrition, or the brutal working situations in the experimental quarters. Our bodies have been buried in unmarked graves in a far-flung phase of the plantation. Pierce also furnished facts about the wider network of consumers. He had been gifted at meetings wherein Blackwood mentioned purchases with different plantation proprietors, rich businessmen, and even some politicians. The conversations he overheard found out that the trafficking network extended a long way past what investigators had imagined. Youngsters have been being sold and bought throughout the complete UEZ, with one-of-a-kind buyers having special requirements and functions. The maximum surprising revelation got here whilst Pierce defined a meeting he had witnessed in the fall of 1833. Blackwood had hosted what he known as a demonstration for potential buyers from throughout the South. The occasion changed into design to exhibit the best of the youngsters to be had through the community, and to illustrate the diverse makes use of to which they will be positioned. Pierce's description of this gathering changed into so disturbing that numerous individuals of the grand jury needed to depart the room. The demonstration had blanketed presentations of the children's capacity to perform numerous forms of work, their responses to exclusive varieties of punishment and manipulate, and their suitability for specific kinds of exploitation. The buyers have been endorsed to look at the kids closely, to test their reactions, and to area orders for precise kinds of sufferers. The entire occasion had been conducted with the casual enterprise-like environment of a cattle auction. PC's testimony additionally discovered the economic scope of the community. The prices paid for children numerous dramatically based on their age, physical condition, and meant use. More youthful children who will be more effortlessly controlled and conditioned commanded better fees. Kids with specific bodily characteristics or competencies were offered at premium charges. The entire amount of money worried inside the network become estimated to be within the loads of lots of bucks, a fortune for the term. The investigation crew used PC's records to coordinate raids on more than one locations throughout the South. Federal marshals running with neighborhood regulation enforcement concurrently struck at plantations, warehouses, and different centers where trafficked children have been being held. The raids have been conducted in secrecy to prevent the destruction of proof and the breakout of key perpetrators. The consequences of the coordinated raids have been fantastic. Over 100 additional youngsters were rescued from various locations. Physical evidence changed into seized that documented the total quantity of the trafficking community, which include monetary information, correspondence, and specified logs of purchases and sales. Several prominent people have been arrested, along with Henry Blackwood, 2 physicians from Charleston Scientific University, and a nation legislator from Georgia, who have been one of the network's satisfactory clients. The evidence seized all through the raids painted an image of systematic evil that bowled over the state. The trafficking network had been operating for over 30 years, had worried dozens of main buyers and dealers, and had victimized masses of children. The extent of enterprise and sophistication become unprecedented for any criminal corporation of the term. The clinical experiments conducted by Blackwood and his pals have been documented in scary element. The record confirmed that the experimenters had intentionally inflamed youngsters with sicknesses to observe their development, had tested numerous poisons and pollutants, and had carried out surgical methods without anesthesia or proper medical training. The youngsters were dealt with as disposable research subjects, their lives valued only for the medical know-how that would be extracted from their suffering. The research also revealed the corruption that had made the network possible. Officials at orphanages, bad homes, and local governments had been bribed to provide children or to ignore their disappearances. Judges had been paid to claim kids deserted or to approve adoptions that have been surely income. Even a few police officers have been worried in protecting up proof and intimidating witnesses. The legal lawsuits that followed might drag on for years as prosecutors struggled to carry justice to victims of crimes that had occurred throughout a couple of states and jurisdictions. The complexity of the case, combined with the wealth and political connections of some of the defendants, made prosecution extraordinarily tough. Numerous key defendants escaped conviction on technical grounds or through the influence of powerful allies. But the public publicity of the trafficking community had profound consequences that extended some distance beyond the felony proceedings. The Sullivan case had become a catalyst for the primary federal law addressing toddler trafficking and abuse. It caused reforms in the oversight of orphanages and terrible houses, and to the status quo of new felony protections for inclined kids. The final resolution of the Sullivan case could take nearly 5 years to finish, but its effect on American society changed into instantaneous and profound. The public response to the revelations changed into one of horrified fascination, blended with a determination to save you such atrocities from happening once more. Newspapers across the USA protected the story in remarkable element, with many courses dedicating entire issues to the investigation's findings. The surviving kids faced a long and tough course to recuperation. Most have been held for years and had no reminiscence of lifestyles before their captivity. The 47 youngsters rescued from the Sullivan basement required widespread scientific remedy, psychological care, and patient paintings to assist them readjust to everyday human interplay. Many never fully recovered from their ordeal, sporting bodily and emotional scars for the relaxation in their lives. Rebecca, the 12 months antique girl whose testimony had been important to exposing the wider network, have become something of a superstar as information of her courage spread. However, the attention proved overwhelming for a person who had persevered such trauma. She became sooner or later positioned with a Quaker-owned family in Pennsylvania. Rebecca lived to be 73 years antique, in the end marrying and raising a circle of relatives of her very own. However, she never spoke publicly, approximately her experiences once more after the trial testimony. The felony lawsuits found out the overall volume of the corruption that had enabled the trafficking community. Ezra Sullivan, who had been captured in the course of the initial raid, became convicted on a couple of fees of kidnapping, imprisonment, and homicide. He turned into finished by using hanging in Richmond on November 15, 1836. Earlier than a crowd of over 30 human beings. His remaining phrases, consistent with witnesses, had been a confession that he had followed the Satan's direction and a plea for forgiveness from the children he had helped to torture. Henry Blackwood's trial had become a sensation that exposed the darkish underbelly of Southern plantation society. The scientific facts seized from his plantation supplied proof of systematic torture and homicide that shocked even hardened observers. Blackwood became convicted of a couple of murders and sentenced to death, but his execution became behind schedule for years through appeals and political maneuvering. He subsequently died in prison in 1841, reportedly of a coronary heart attack, though some suspected he had been poisoned by means of buddies who feared he might screen additional secrets and techniques. The 2 physicians from Charleston Clinical College who had participated in the experiments, had been expelled from the medical career and sentenced to long jail phrases. Their instances brought about new policies governing medical research and the remedy of human subjects. The clinical university itself confronted a scandal that nearly led to its closure, as investigators found out that several different faculty individuals had information of the unlawful experiments, however, didn't file them. The investigation's most frustrating component became the quantity of powerful, those who escaped justice in spite of clear proof of their involvement. Several rich plantation proprietors fled to Europe before they could be arrested. Others used their political connections to keep away from prosecution or to obtain minimum sentences that didn't replicate the severity in their crime. A nation legislator from Georgia, who were one of the community's main clients, was censured by way of his legislature, but in no way confronted criminal expenses. The financial investigation discovered that the trafficking network had generated good-sized earnings for its organizers. Constance Sullivan alone had accumulated over $12,000 in income over her 20-year operation, a sum equivalent to several hundred zero in cutting-edge forks. A great deal of this cash became in no way recovered, as it had been invested in legitimate businesses or hidden in accounts that investigators couldn't trace. The Sullivan farm itself became a symbol of the horrors that had been exposed. The assets became seized with the aid of the authorities and subsequently offered at auction, but nobody wanted to live in an area associated with such evil. The residence turned into demolished in 1845, and the basement become filled with concrete and sealed completely. A small cemetery changed into established on the website to memorialize the children who had died there. Even though maximum of their names have been never known, the case brought about good-sized reforms in toddler welfare and protection. Virginia surpassed the first comprehensive toddler protection legal guidelines in American history, establishing authorities' oversight of orphanages and requiring history assessments for all and sundry in search of to adopt or take care of big numbers of youngsters. Other states fast followed with comparable law, growing the inspiration for present-day child welfare structures. The federal authorities also answered with new laws addressing interstate crimes and human trafficking. The Sullivan case had tested the restrictions of kingdom by means of country law enforcement, while managing crimes that crossed jurisdictional limitations. New federal statutes gave marshals accelerated authority to investigate and prosecute trafficking cases, establishing precedents that might show vital in later crook justice trends. Possibly most significantly, the case changed public awareness about the vulnerability of children and the need for systematic protection. The romantic notion of the charitable character being concerned for orphan kids changed by way of a extra practical knowledge of the need for institutional oversight and criminal safeguard. The phrase "every other Sullivan case" entered commonplace utilization as a caution about the capability for abuse in situations related to susceptible youngsters. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the physician who had unknowingly enabled the Sullivan operation through his clinical consultations, devoted the relaxation of his career to infant welfare. He established unfastened clinics, specifically for orphaned and abandoned kids, and became an advisor for reforms in scientific exercise that would prevent physicians from being manipulated with the aid of criminals. His later writings on scientific ethics had been influenced closely by using his enjoy with the Sullivan case. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, who had led the initial investigation, became promoted to federal marshal and spent the rest of his career pursuing comparable cases. He had become one of the first cops to concentrate on crimes towards youngsters, developing investigative strategies and tactics that might be used for decades. Crawford's distinctive reports at the Sullivan case became required analyzing for law enforcement officials across the ES of A. The kids' stories, as they emerged over time, found out the whole scope of human resilience and the long-term consequences of systematic abuse. Some, like Rebecca, had been capable of construct distinctly normal lives with right guide and care. Others struggled with intellectual contamination, addiction, and different troubles that stemmed from their traumatic studies. A few by no means recovered at all, dying younger from headaches related to their years of imprisonment and abuse. The network's correspondence, which had been preserved as evidence, furnished investigators with facts that brought about additional cases for years after the initial discovery. Letters discovered in the Sullivan basement contained references to other operations, different sufferers, and other perpetrators. Some of those leads ended in hit prosecutions, while others led to useless ends or situations wherein an excessive amount of time had exceeded to accumulate sufficient evidence. One of the most haunting components of the case became the conclusion that the Sullivan operation had been simply a part of a far large gadget of exploitation that had existed in large part undetected for decades. The research found out that similar networks had operated in other components of the United States, that kids were bought like commodities at some point of American history, and that the felony and social systems had been insufficient to shield the maximum susceptible contributors of society. The case additionally highlighted the role of community obligation in stopping such atrocity. The residents of Millbrook, who had lived for 20 years subsequent to one of the most bad crime scenes in American records, struggled with guilt and self-exam. How had they failed to see what changed into occurring? What symptoms had they neglected or not noted? They've prevented the struggling if they had been greater vigilant or suspicious. Those questions cause broader discussions about the duty of communities to look out for his or her most susceptible contributor. The Sullivan case became a cautionary story, approximately the risks of accepting explanations without research, of respecting privateness while that enabled abuse, and of assuming that first-rate appearances assured ethical conduct. The legacy of the Sullivan case extended some distance beyond the immediately legal and social reforms it inspired. The particular documentation of the research, which includes the correspondence, monetary information, and testimony, became a useful resource for know-how the records of crime and exploitation in the United States. Historians, criminologists, and social reformers might look at the case for generations. The use of it to apprehend how systematic evil should flourish in reputedly normal groups. Ultimately, the Sullivan circle of relatives' reign of terror turned into introduced to and quit, no longer via sophisticated police work or advanced investigative techniques, but with the aid of the easy courage of regular individuals who refuse to ignore apparent signs and symptoms of problem. William Hutchinson's decision to report what he had heard, Sheriff Crawford's willingness to take network concerns critically, and Rebecca's willpower to testify no matter her trauma. Those character acts of moral braveness have been what in the long run exposed one of the maximum bad crook businesses in American records. The basement where 47 kids were located chained has been sealed for over a century, but the echoes of their struggling preserve to remind us of the significance of vigilance, courage, and compassion in defense of those who cannot defend themselves. The Sullivan case stands as both a testament to human evil and a reminder of the power of man or woman, judgment of right and wrong, to triumph over even the most entrenched structures of exploitation and abuse. If this story has given you chills, you recognize why those darkish chapters of American records have to in no way be forgotten. Simply whilst we notion we might visible all of it, the horror in locations like the Sullivan Farm intensifies our understanding of the way evil can cover at the back of respectable facades. If this tale is giving you chills, percentage this video with a chum who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to guide our content. And bear in mind to enroll and by no means leave out tales like this. Let's find out together what other secrets lie buried in the UCs beyond. This mystery indicates us that evil regularly wears the masks of respectability, and that the most terrible crimes can be devoted with the aid of those who appear most regular to their communities. What do you believe you studied of this story? Do you trust the whole thing turned into found out? Or are there nevertheless secrets and techniques buried inside the Virginia hills? Go away your comment underneath. In case you enjoyed this tale and need extra horror memories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and proportion with someone who loves mysteries. The darkness of Yank history has many greater secrets to show, and we'll be right here to find all of them. See you inside the next video.